Hello, everyone. This is Dorie Clark, and we are here with Newsweek's weekly interview show, Better. Our guest this week is Deepa Purushothaman. She is the author of the new book, The First, The Few, The Only. And we are here to talk about how to redefine power in the workplace. Deepa, so great to have you here.
I'm so excited to be here and to be in conversation with you of all people, Dorie.
Thank you. Well, congratulations. And of course, we'd like to say hello to all the great people who are tuning in live and joining us. So if you are here, please feel free to type into the chat box and let us know who you are and where you're dialing in from. And we will, of course, be taking your questions for Deepa as well. So Deepa, let's go ahead and dive right in. So the premise of your book, the title, The First, The Few, The Only, we're talking about women of color in corporate America. We all know that the numbers are not where any of us want them to be right now. But obviously, this has become a topic that, especially over the past couple of years, since the George Floyd protests and things like that, has been very much more on the radar of corporate America. From the time that you first started conceptualizing this book to now it being out, can you talk a little bit about what you see as having changed or not changed in the past couple of years?
Absolutely. I think a lot has changed, Dorie. And I do want to say one other thing, just because I think it's helpful to set context. I wrote the book for women of color, but I also didn't envision COVID necessarily in the way that it's gone on.
What did you miss, Deepa? You didn't predict it?
But so I think it's important to say, because I think what I'm realizing, and so many people are picking up the book outside of, women of color and saying it also speaks to me, right? So I think it speaks to a lot of women. I think it speaks to even white men who are also struggling with the place that work takes in our life, and how maybe, given the last few years, the fact that we don't all want to just live to work anymore. So I just want to kind of say that outright, that I think some of the themes actually do apply to everybody. And I'm realizing that as I'm doing my book tour in a very different way. But you're right, like the vernacular around race, how we talk about women of color, the term women of color, all of that has evolved significantly in the last few years. And when I first envisioned the book, I think I was struggling with some of that language. And as I started writing more and more, I got more comfortable that, yes, it would be a little bit forward thinking, but I also think we're going to continue to evolve in these spaces. And we just, if I didn't get it perfect this time, we'll get it perfect next time, right? Or as close as we can. And so it has been a process. I think when I first started thinking about the book and writing about the book, we didn't really have space to talk about the fact that racism happens in workplaces, right? That was such a new concept. And it was something that I think people were really uncomfortable talking about. It was just starting to break open when, when I sold the book and all of this happened. And so it has been a process to really evolve where I thought the book would go and where it's landed. And how it's speaking to people.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. We're here with Deepa Purushothaman. She's the author of the new book, The First, The Few, The Only. And if you want to learn more about Deepa and her work, you can go to her website. It's deepapuru.com. So Deepa, a question that comes to mind, which I know is sort of an interesting and complex one, is that on one hand, you're talking about the experience of women of color in general, but also I know that, one of the conversational flashpoints that happens sometimes is that the experience of African-American women, Hispanic women is sometimes different than Asian or South Asian women. So I know that as part of your research process for this book, you literally had conversations and gatherings, salons with hundreds of women of color. So what have you learned about the commonalities of the experience and the differences of the experience, and how to sort of, navigate those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what I'm saying. When I struggled with the term women of color, it was really hard for me early on to even feel like I had permission to write this book. I mean, Dorie, I reached out to you early on as I was thinking of writing a book, just as, you advise so many people on just get started. And it was one of the things I really struggled with, right? Did I even have permission as an Indian woman to write a book on women of color? I do think where possible, I have tried to define and separate out where separate groups have different experiences. So where the experience of Black women in corporate spaces is different, I have tried to highlight that it is different, for example, in the pay space, right? Or in some of the stereotypes around angry Black women. Like there are places in the book where I do call that out. But what I found is that there were more commonalities than I expected. So to answer your question, how the book started was I really struggled with whether or not I wanted to stay or go in my own corporate role. So I spent 20 years in one company, had a really, magical career, moved really fast. And then towards the last 3 years of my career, I knew I wanted to leave. I was starting to get sick. I had growing questions around purpose, but I found it really hard to leave. I was a first, right? I was a first sitting in a seat. And so I felt like all eyes were on me. I felt responsible to the women of color coming up after me and around me, that if I left, or if I, said, I don't want to do this anymore, would it be signaling failure, not only my own failure, but failure for other people? In an attempt to figure out like how I stay or go, and where does one go after 20 years in one company, which is very unusual these days. I started gathering women of color. It started one-on-one. Eventually it turned into two-person, three-person. And then I did a dozen dinners with my now business partner across the country. We had 20 or 30 women of color each. And that's really what started the book and even the company that I started, because we would get in those rooms, I thought, for 1 or 2 hours, 6, 7, 8 hours later, Dorie, we were still in the rooms talking, because our experience was so shared, and the loneliness was shared, right? And the challenges we faced, the microaggressions, the racism, the having to prove yourself over and over again. So that's where I started to see a lot of the patterns. I also saw some differences. So the big difference to me that I've seen is there are some Black women who have been taught about race early and taught systems are not fair in a very different way than I think a lot of the rest of us are. So in my family, for example, we didn't talk about race at all. And I found that to be common for a lot of the Latina and a lot of the Asian women that I met. So there wasn't that discussion. There was this idea, just work harder, be grateful, it'll be okay. And you get into these systems, and when they don't show up in the same way, right? Or we experience something that feels different, that being grateful and working harder doesn't really do us a service, right? It actually does us a disservice. And so that's where I've seen some of the differences. And I do try and call out in the book where it's different, but I would tell you, Dory, the stories are very similar across the board.
That's fascinating. Thank you. We're here with Deepa Purushothaman. She's the author of The First, The Few, The Only. And if you're enjoying this conversation, hit the like and share button so your colleagues can benefit from it on the social channels that you're using. We want to say hi to some of the great folks who are tuning in live to join us. Tom is here from Northwestern University Kellogg, Madeline from Minneapolis, Gail is here in North Carolina, Sophia from London, Anna Maria is saying hi from Alberta, Canada, Sushma is here from India. We've got a LinkedIn user from Hong Kong. Joy is here from Calgary. Nathaniel from Austin. Vani is here from the south of France. Moses from Ghana. Ashish from India. Shahid from Pakistan. Adnan from Turkey. Mubina from Pakistan. You guys can all form a better subgroup. I love this. We're so glad to have you here and more. And we're here to take your questions for Deepa Purushothaman about how to redefine power at work, and also the experience about questions around women of color at work, and how we can all be more thoughtful about this. Now, Deepa, a question that I have, I know you used to lead the Deloitte University, let's see if I get this right. There's a lot of words in it, but the
Yes.
Leadership Center for Inclusion out of Deloitte. And some of the great research that was done was around the topic of covering. Can you explain a little bit more about what covering is and how that might impact? I mean, certainly the research shows is quite interesting. It impacts everyone, but perhaps disproportionately women of color. What does that look like, and what does that mean for us?
Sure. And I want to be clear, because I only want to take credit for what I've done. I led our women's initiative, right? And I had a large role in inclusion. There were others who actually led that initiative, like Chrissy Smith, right? Who's a great friend and has done amazing work in the space. And that was actually her work. So she worked with a professor. They did all this research to realize that a lot of people, right, cover, a lot of people hide parts of themselves. And so it is, I think, a universal phenomenon. I think part of what she unpacked, and part of what I've continued to unpack with my work, is that I think certain groups cover more. And that's part of what I'm trying to showcase here. I think what I found, Dorie, is that a lot of people are open to the conversation that maybe the workplace is not a meritocracy. That's a very new conversation. And that's really the main point of my book, is that the workplace is not necessary. Corporate America is not a meritocracy, and it's okay to talk about that. But what I'm finding, especially from a lot of the white male leaders that I'm meeting with, is they want me to help them understand how. Like I can see that that's possible, but I don't really understand how, because we've never talked about it. And what I found for women of color is that the covering is a lot more profound. So the covering shows up in code switching. It shows up in the language in which we speak. It shows up in the things we share at work.
So what's code switching, Deepa, for people who don't know what that is?
Code switching is kind of fitting into the atmosphere you're in. So changing how you talk, what you talk about, what you focus on, as a result of that's kind of the norm in the space you're in. So in a professional setting, it'd probably be switching to more of a white male normative, language, behavior, characteristics, because that's kind of what's expected of you. And so that is like really hard. And I tell a story in the book where think about like working in when you're traveling, right? Think of working overseas and speaking in a different language, like doing business all day in a different language. Those days when I worked a lot in Latin America, those days were really trying for me. It was really hard. I get to the end of the day and I was exhausted. A lot of women of color that I speak with say that that's how they feel every day, because there is a level of translation, a level of kind of switching out what they talk about, what they focus on. There's also a lot of other things that show up differently, for us in the covering space. So we don't often talk about the fact that, we have a different experience at home. So a lot of the women I interviewed, especially from immigrant households or households where there's more traditional patriarchy at home, right? We're expected to do things like make all the meals and take care of the kids, and outsourcing those activities was not acceptable in their house. There was an expectation they were going to do it. I even highlight in the Renewee, who tells a story about how her mother, after she was named CEO, right? Her mother actually said to her, like, that's great, now go get the milk, right? Like there is a real, I think, dichotomy for some of these women about what the expectations are at home. And so that's another example of how we cover those things, right? We don't necessarily talk about those things. And I think part of what I'm trying to highlight is we think of professional, we think of leadership, unfortunately, in a very rigid sort of way. And I think we're in a moment where I want to break that open for us. And I want women of color to see themselves as leaders. I think, Dorie, it's really hard. Like I never saw myself on television. I didn't have a lot of role models. We're just starting to have more of them in the last couple of years. And when you don't see yourself, right, I think you end up like making up for yourself. You don't belong or that you don't fit in. And as a result, you hide parts of yourself, you cover parts of yourself. There's a lot of shame involved. And so that's really, I think, what we're talking about with women of color.
Thank you so much, Deepa. We want to say hi to some of the great folks tuning in. Lindsay's joining us from the Northeast of the United States. Gabriel's here from Mexico. Tom is chiming in here. Tom has added your book, Deepa, to the Leadership Coaching Toolkit. So that is pretty exciting. Way to go,
Thank
Tom.
you.
Love that. Cheryl's here from Minneapolis, St. Paul. Robbie from Menlo Park. We've got Matthew from Bogota. Satya from Chicago. Subu from Pittsburgh. We've got Rose Jean from Milburn, and India from Orange County, California. We're so glad to have all of you here. And a question came in for you, Deepa, from
Sure.
Annette. Annette's in Southern California. She is curious. She says, you had this job for 20 years. The last few years you were questioning your purpose. What provoked you to make the leap? Was it actually the result of having these dinners and talking with other women of color? Or, what was it that finally convinced you to make a change and to go out on your own and to write this book?
Yeah, I love that question, because I think, Dorie, that's what I was trying to say with the first question. Like that's what's coming up as people are reading it, right? I think we're all in this debate over the space that work takes up in our life and the Great Resignation. And a lot of people are questioning. So I left my role in the first few months of COVID. So before everyone was doing it. And there were a lot of people that told me I needed to have stability. Like what was I doing leaving this really stable job where I'd been for decades, right at the height of like the uncertainty? And it's really interesting because I got a lot of feedback that said you should always be going to something. You should never leave when you don't have the next thing set. And Dorie, I mean, you know this, I didn't have the next thing set. I kind of just took a little bit of a leap, and I just trusted that the universe would have me, right? That it was time to go. And so for me, it was really a health discussion. It was really that I just felt like it was time. And so I tell a story in the book where I had met my 14th doctor. I had, Dorie, for me, I had growing symptoms. So for 3 years, I'd been getting sick. I'd been questioning things around purpose. The symptoms were mounting. I had started to get really, really ill. And I met this doctor. She's someone I met when I traveled. So I remember very clearly, she was looking at my suitcase in the corner of the room and had already made judgment. Like, why is this woman bringing her suitcase to her doctor's appointment? This is my third appointment with her. And she looks at me and she says, we can keep doing tests, or I can tell you what I think you already know. Your job is killing you. And then she asked me these 3 really profound questions, life-changing questions. She said, what would you do if you didn't do this job? Do you have to have a big job like this to feel productive or feel worthy? And can you just see that you're worthy being you? And Dorie, I felt seen through, right? My entire identity had been work until that point, and I felt like she saw through me. And so for me, I think it was realizing that my health had to be part of the success question. And I think that's really what's new for me. I don't think now I can define success without health. And I think a few years ago, those were 2 different things. Like there's a lot you're taught in these corporate spaces about sacrificing your body, sacrificing your family time, sacrificing, right, to get ahead. That's like the mentality. And that wasn't working for me anymore. So for me, it was really the health crisis. And then, yes, meeting the women and realizing there's something happening to all of us. And I want to go figure that out for myself, but figure it out for my sisters too. That's really what changed.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, Deepa. And your comments are definitely resonating. I see Gina's chiming in here. She says, I am definitely one of those people who was taught as an immigrant Black woman, work hard, but keep your head down. And she says, I had to learn how to counter that. Thank you for that, Gina. And we have Nankonda who's writing in. She says, code switching resonates so much. I think I even do it in my dreams.
Yes.
So I think you're making a lot of sense here. Thank you for sharing that. We want to welcome some of our great friends who are tuning in as well. We have Janet joining us. We have Isra from Somaliland, Zulima from Monterrey, Mexico. We have Tamina from Dhaka, Bangladesh, Bruce from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Kuzehan from Bethesda, Inji from Toronto, Angela's here, Marua from Morocco, and many more. We're really glad to have all of you here. And a question that I have, Deepa, and actually this is one that. Oh my goodness, that was a loud cat noise. But so I think Philip the cat has a question. Yes, but we will let Tom ask it. So Tom wants to know, what are your top actions? It could be one, it could be top three, that we can all take to deliver outcomes and true change. I think this is especially true if you are someone who considers yourself an ally. Let's say you are not yourself a woman of color. What can you do to be helpful in this process?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you one specific example because I feel like, Dorie, that's actually the question that I'm getting asked the most. Like, what can I do to help? Right. And I think what's interesting is that we just don't talk about race enough. We don't talk about racism at work. We don't talk about how to deal with these situations. And so in the book, I talk about if you are facing a microaggression or if you're facing a racist incident, here are three things you can do. And for women of color, I say practice, for example, these three sayings or any three sayings that work for you so that you know what to do when someone says something inappropriate or something that offends you. And what I want allies to do is to realize that they can practice those things too, because I think part of what we don't give ourselves permission to understand is that as allies, we're not taught what to say and what to do when someone says something. And we're all kind of looking at each other. Did that just happen? And not knowing what to do in the moment. So I ask women of color to have something practice when someone says something, because it's absolutely going to happen. But what I'm asking allies to do is the same thing. So if you see something, have something ready that says what you just said or what you just did doesn't feel appropriate. Can we stop the meeting and talk about what was just said? Is everyone okay? I'm not comfortable with what was just said. Whatever that is for you, but practice three things so you know what to do in the moment. Because so many of us are caught flat-footed, not because we don't want to help, because we're kind of like shocked. Was that just really just said? What do you do? And we also are afraid of being rude or mean or, like making it worse. And we just need to get comfortable. Like if someone says something, it's okay to say, like, can you help us unpack what was just done?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Deepa. And I want to ask a follow-up on that as well, because I think oftentimes what trips a lot of people up is, there's certain things that I think probably just about everybody can agree would be, hardcore, inappropriate, etc. It's rare that would overtly be said in the workplace. Not impossible, but rare. Yes. What is far more common is what I will kind of call the gray area situations where it might be debatable whether it's racist or sexist. Yeah. How do you respond and also not necessarily shame the person if they are not, presumably they're not intending to do something hurtful? What would be the way that somebody could approach that when it's not super clear that it is out of bounds?
And I would say, Dorie, one thing that surprised me is how many stories women of color had of things that were out of bounds. I just want to say that. So I think I am myself shocked when it happens, and it happened to me. I was always in a new client, and there was frequently something that was said that was pretty clearly offensive. So I just want to say that outright for the women who have experienced that. But I think you're right. There's a lot of gray area. I kind of do the spectrum sort of language where I say, like, there's microaggressions that might not, really land in the same way, but then there's racism. And I think there is spectrum, because some people will feel certain things that are said are actually racist, and you may not even understand that, right, or see that. I think it's okay to approach it with this sort of thinking of, you don't always have to hit everybody over the head with a hammer, right? Like that's probably not the right approach in every sort of moment. So taking someone aside. So I have this rule, and it's a newer rule. It's not something I knew 10 or 20 years ago. I kind of listen to my gut. So if someone says something and I feel heat, right, literally in my stomach, like that's where I feel my anger, I will see if I feel that feeling for 10 minutes. If I feel that feeling for 10 minutes, then I will say something. I might not say it in front of everybody. I might say, can we have a sidebar? And I just want to share with you like how I'm feeling, because I know, Dorie, if I feel something wrong for 10 minutes, I'm going to like literally ruminate on it for days. Right. And so I'm trying to protect myself and set my own boundaries. I think what I would say is it's okay to approach somebody and say, I really need to have a conversation with you about what was just said and how it lands for me. I think that's part of what you're getting at is it's not necessarily what you said and your intent and how you said it. It's a little bit of how it lands. And we just need to have space to have those conversations and not approach everything that everyone is doing something to us, but a little bit of, I want to help you understand how that feels for me and why that makes me feel like I don't belong. That's a lot of what this is about. Things are said or things are done. And unfortunately, they make us feel like we don't belong. And that's not what I think a lot of people are intending, but that's really what the outcome is.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're here with Deepa Purushothaman. She's the author of The First, The Few, The Only, and we're talking about how to redefine power at work. Deepa, I think your last answer touches on this a bit, but if there's anything more you wanted to add, Gina had a great follow-up. She says, how do you help leaders overcome the fear that they feel about wanting to talk about race at work?
Yes.
It's a loaded thing. They probably know, okay, I could mess this up. I could get into trouble. So what are your thoughts about how to approach that or just de-escalate that?
Yeah, Gina is right. I mean, it is one of the hardest parts of this work. I think we're in a moment, especially right now with cancel culture, where people are just afraid of saying the wrong thing. So I tell a story in the book where I met with a white leader right after George Floyd's murder. A call from a friend who said, can you help the CEO of a tech company? He wants to put out a letter to his company, but he's afraid of saying the wrong thing. And we stayed, I stayed up with him one whole night rewriting the letter over and over again, because anytime I'd put anything in it that felt like important words, he would say, I don't know if I can say that. I don't want to say anything controversial. And I think that, Dorie, that's the unfortunate part of this. Like, this work is going to feel controversial to some people, and we just have to get okay with that. I have said the word permission a few times, but for me, permission is so important. It's permission for women of color to set their boundaries and do things, but it's also permission for, our other leaders to get it wrong. Like, we have to try. We have to be willing to try. This is hard work. We didn't get here in a couple of months or in a couple of years. This has been centuries, right? This has been decades growing. And so I think we just have to realize that fear is holding us back from progress, and we all have to be willing to try. And by the way, I think to change cultures, we need to all work together. I don't think that women of color can do it on our own. It has to be all of our work.
Yes, absolutely. For those who are watching, if you are enjoying this conversation and want to make sure that you never miss one of our weekly Better shows, it happens every Thursday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. You can follow me on LinkedIn. Just go to DorieClark.com/LinkedIn. You can follow me. You can sign up for my newsletter there, and you will get reminders about these conversations. And if you want to learn more about Deepa and her work, just go to deepapuru.com and you can check out her book, The First, The Few, The Only. So Deepa, a great question came in from Phyllis. I love the attitude, Phyllis. She says, Phyllis from New York City is here to learn more. And she says, do you think that there's covering and code switching on the basis of age or generation as well? What are your thoughts about that, Deepa?
Yes, Phyllis. So an article just came out yesterday. PBS did an article with me around this conversation, because as I'm having more and more discussions, a lot of women are sharing with me ageism is a real and growing topic, especially over Zoom. For whatever reason, it almost feels exasperated. So I think a lot of people cover how old they are, and especially women. What I'm finding is that there is definite ageism. After the age of 45, 50, a lot of women are sharing stories with me that it's really difficult, and that we tend to, in the same way that we have microaggressions towards, racism or folks of a different race, we have microaggressions around ageism. So I think it's a real thing. I think in the same way that I tell women of color to find their power, I think we have to get comfortable with ourselves as we age and get comfortable with where our thoughts are on it. And once we're clear and once we find our power, then we can realize what we're willing to push back on. But it is a real, and I think a growing thing for women right now. Absolutely.
Thank you, Deepa. We want to say hi to some of the great folks tuning in. Khaled is here from Belgium. We have Pooja in the house. We have Anna from New Hampshire. We have Shahid. We're so glad to have all of you, and we're taking your questions for Deepa Purushothaman, author of The First, The Few, The Only. Now, Deepa, you were alluding to this a little earlier, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about it. There is the common saying that you need to see it to be it. But some people agree with that. Some people do not agree with that. Yes. Can you break that down a little bit and tell us your perspective?
Yeah, I tell a story in the book where, again, because I was a first, right? I didn't have a lot of role models that looked like me. There wasn't another Indian female partner ahead of me that I could emulate. So I really struggled. I wanted to see models that looked like me. And when I looked around, I saw a lot of great leaders, but they didn't necessarily resonate in the way that I needed them to resonate for me. And so I started pulling leadership styles from a number of different leaders I saw and kind of created my own. And I had a mantra. I literally had this email that I kept in draft because I traveled all the time. So I didn't carry paper. And it literally said, you don't have to see it to be it. And I think that was so important for me prior to making partner and even as an early partner to kind of say that, to remind myself that I could be my own kind of leader. Because Dorie, I think most of us, there is that saying, right, that you have to see it in order to be it. But when you don't, like when we don't see it, what do? Does that mean we just accept that we don't, we can't be it? Like you have to find a way to become it. And that's, I think, a form of power, is realizing for yourself, what messages do you want to inherit from other people, and what messages do you want to write for yourself? And so that was something I very consciously did, and really helped me, I think, get to the places that I got, because I didn't see it and I had to find a different way to do it.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that, Deepa. A great question came in from a LinkedIn user who is curious if you're someone who has experienced some kind of incident, a
Mhm.
microaggression, et cetera, you're feeling exposed, you're
Mhm.
feeling vulnerable, you're feeling hurt. How do you manage to have those difficult conversations after somebody has offended you when you're still feeling so raw? Is there a way that you can get better at doing that so that it's not compounding the injury?
Yeah, I think it's really important that you take care of yourself first. That's the most important thing. So, if speaking up in the moment is not going to help you, if that's going to cause you more trauma, please don't do it, right? Like it has to be about you. What I find though, and the research shows that we tend to hold on to negative comments 4 times as long than positive comments, right? So that is just what human beings do. And so part of what I have found is if we don't actually do something or don't say something, we end up for weeks thinking about it. And I tell stories in the book where some of the women I interviewed like hold on to things for months, right? I mean, I held on to something. I tell a story in the book about a friend, calling me a token basically, and I held that for years, right? It's not until we talk about it that we feel better. So if you're not comfortable, confronting the microaggressor, one of the biggest learnings in the book is I want you to find the power of me, and I want you to find the power of we, right? So the power of me is kind of figuring out for yourself, what are your own messages? What do you believe? Not what your parents have told you, not what society has told you, not what others have told you. But then the power of we is really important, because I think we can't process these things without support. So if you're not ready to confront your microaggressor or the person who has been racist to you, find sisters, find other people to have the conversation with. Sometimes just telling a friend can actually be a way to process what you're feeling and figure out how do you want to confront the person. I just think it's really important to not do this work by yourself, because it is really hard.
Yeah, that's terrific. We probably have time for one more question. We've
Okay.
been here with Deepa Purushothaman, author of the new book, The First, the Few, the Only. If you want to learn more, go to deepapuru.com. And if you want to make sure you never miss one of our special weekly Newsweek interview shows, go to dorieclark.com. You can sign up for the newsletter there, get a self-assessment, and you can make sure that you are always tuning in to the great conversations that we're talking about. So, Deepa, a great question came in from Nankanda. She's wondering, as we're having these important conversations, how do we frame it for young women of color, perhaps people who are new in the workforce, just entering the workforce? How do we talk about this in productive ways that doesn't scare them, that doesn't make them
Yes.
think, oh no, this is going to be a
Yeah.
terrible, toxic place for me? How do we strike that balance?
Yeah, I think that the bottom line is I think folks who are less tenured, that's what I call them, are smarter than we were, to be honest with you. I think they're well aware. So I interviewed people at all stages of their career, including women who were just entering, the workplace. And most of them believed this would happen. Most of them, I think, see inclusion and diversity in very different ways than you and I do, Dory. Like their language around it is just fundamentally different. They don't see the categories that I think we grew up with. It's a lot more fluid. It's a lot more conversational for them. But what I would say is the difference that I found is they're not willing to put up with it, right? So they went into a lot of workplaces believing I'm going to be there for a year or two. I'm not going to be there for 20 years. So if I see something or if I experience something, I'm just going to move on and create my own company. I'm just getting experiences so I can go create my own. So I think it's okay to have these conversations. I also think if we don't have these conversations, we don't prepare people. So many of the women of color I met were just kind of stunned when things happened to them because they assumed it wouldn't, that it had gotten better, because everyone talks about with each generation, it's gotten better. In some ways it has, but some things haven't changed. So let's prepare them. Let's talk to them, but let's also tell them what to do and how to get through it. I think that's the important message.
Fantastic. Deepa Purushothaman, author of The First, the Few, the Only. You can check it out, get your copy, go to deepapuru.com. Thank you all for tuning in, and Deepa, and a special thanks to you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dorie. It was a pleasure.
Take care and see everyone next week.